We think of Christmas, sadly, the way we think of wedding days in our culture. All the chaos and frenzy and stress building up for one day, and then it's gone. But Christmas nor wedding days are just that. Christmas is a season. And prior to Christmas, we have the Advent season, which is a time of waiting and preparation, building up for that celebration time that lasts 12 days. The McGrath Institute for Church Life here at the University of Notre Dame is now in its 4th year in hosting its International Creche Exhibit and Pilgrimage. And it offers us a wonderful way to step out of the hustle and bustle of the Christmas season and to attune our hearts and minds to the true spiritual meaning of Christmas. The theme of this year's International Creche Exhibit and Pilgrimage is En Camino a Belén, or Journeying to Bethlehem. I would like to suggest 2 theological motifs to guide us on this journey through the Advent and Christmas seasons. The first theological motif is that of migration. The second theological motif is that of human dignity. Migration is an excellent way to think about the spirituality of the Advent season. We have no greater example of migration than that of our Holy Family, who are at the center of this season. After leaving Nazareth, they find a place in Bethlehem to give birth to the Christ child. Soon thereafter, they have to leave Bethlehem and escape the Holy Land as exiles, refugees, returning back to Egypt, where the Israelites were held in bondage centuries before. At the heart of this motif of migration is the spiritual act of journeying or waiting for God, which we find at the very center of the Advent season. It's our time to stop and to wait for the arrival and the coming of our Lord. When we look to Hispanic communities, both in Latin America and here in the United States, we find rich customs and traditions and practices that symbolize this spiritual act of journeying and waiting. Perhaps one of the most well-known ones, at least among Mexican communities, is that of Las Posadas. Las Posadas is a 9-day remembrance of the time that Mary and Joseph spent in Bethlehem looking for a place to rest so that our Blessed Mother could give birth to the Lord. On each night, from December 16th through December 24th, Mexican communities will gather together and do processions out in the streets of their communities, knocking on doors, just as the Holy Family did. These processions typically take place in the evening hours, and they entail women and children and men all dressing up in various costumes to commemorate the Holy Family. And as they knock on the doors of neighbors or the various inns, they will often have an exchange or a dialogue with the innkeeper. And so the Holy Family will knock on the door and ask, "In the name of heaven, I ask you for shelter, for my beloved wife can go no farther." At which point the innkeepers will say, "This is not an inn, get on with you, I cannot open the door, you might be a rogue." The person who's presenting themselves as Joseph will say, "Do not be inhuman, show some charity, God in heaven will reward you." And at that point the innkeepers will say, "You may go now and don't bother us anymore, because if I get angry I will beat you." And this exchange will go on until Finally, Joseph will say, "My wife is Mary. She is the Queen of Heaven. She will be mother to the divine Word." And at that point, the innkeeper will finally say, "Is that you, Joseph? Your wife is Mary? Enter, pilgrims. I didn't recognize you." At this point, during the Posada celebrations, the guests will come into the home and there will be festivities taking place indoors where they will eat buñuelos or fried donuts, and they will have tamales, and have just food and drink together. They will also often partake of a beating of the piñata. The piñata is oftentimes made of paper mache, put together in the image of a seven-pointed star, where each point on that star is meant to represent the seven deadly sins. The Posada celebration often takes place over 9 days in order to symbolize the 9 months leading up to the birth of Jesus. During that time as well, Hispanics will also often attend La Misa de Gallo, or the Rooster Mass, in the early morning hours during the Advent season. These masses will occur through the morning hours, and then they will also conclude on the Christmas Eve 12 o'clock midnight Mass, which many of us here are familiar with in the United States. The second theological motif to guide us on our journey and pilgrimage through the Advent and Christmas seasons is that of human dignity. At the center of this motif is the act of adoring, the adoration of the Christ child. In this image we have presented here, we see Saint Francis with his stigmata looking adoringly at the Christ child in Mary's arms, and Joseph in the background in the shadows. When we look to these creche exhibits, we will see that suffering and even evil is not far from our Savior's presence, as a way of almost foreshadowing the long suffering that awaits our Savior's life. Hispanic communities commemorate Christmas Eve as La Noche Buena. Among various Hispanic communities throughout Latin America, they will gather together in order to craft what they call pesebres, which is another word for crèche, which is from the French. Pesebres are the manger scenes. My mom tells me the story of when she was a child growing up in Paraguay, how she would get up in the early morning hours. Her and many of her neighbors would get up and go out to collect stems from various bushes. And after they collected those stems, they would come home and create their own personal pesebre, or manger scene. And once that was done, usually by the afternoon, they would spend the rest of the afternoon and evening going around the community and looking at one another's pesebres. The International Creche exhibit and pilgrimage here at the University of Notre Dame is one way of trying to recreate that custom, which has been so important to many Hispanic communities throughout Latin America. We arrive now to the conclusion of the Advent season in La Navidad, as it's known. Christmas is also known in the Church as the Feast of Human Dignity. When we gather together on Christmas Mass, the collect prayer is read. Thou hast wonderfully established the dignity of human nature, yet has restored it in an even more wonderful way. That Christ, our Lord, has come in the human flesh to heal and restore our brokenness, but also to elevate us, to recreate in us a new heart and a new mind, is truly the very meaning of Christmas. But Christmas doesn't end just on one day. Christmas lasts for 12 days, and it concludes in Hispanic communities with El Día de los Tres Reyes. El Día de los Reyes is commemorated on the Feast of the Epiphany, which is January 6th. El Día de los Reyes is very similar to the way many of us here in the United States celebrate Christmas Day. Children will often leave out shoes as well as grass and water for the camels on their journey in order to welcome and to celebrate the arrival of the three kings who bring gifts for the newly born Christ child. The Feast of the Epiphany, or El Día de los Reyes, is something that is commemorated among Hispanic communities in Latin America as well as here in the United States through processions, also known as barandas, whereby the community will get together and with song and dance and musical instrument will go out into the streets to celebrate the arrival of the three kings who have now come to adore the Christ child. As we conclude, I ask that you look at these images in your creche program that you can download online as almost like icons, drawing us ever nearer to the reality of the dignity of our human nature that has been fully revealed in the person of Christ our Lord. So may you have a blessed and happy Advent. Feliz Adviento.